Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second session in the virtual lecture series entitled Discover Ukraine, History, Culture and its People. This event has been organized by the Basis Study Group for Minority History. We would like to thank our partner URIS Ukrainian Research Initiative, Universidad Internacional de Cuerna, vaca, Oriente Medio News, Bnei Brith, Chile, and Circulo Israelita de Santiago for bringing this course to Latin America. We would like to remind you that this is a fundraising event for us and for Ukraine emergency response. We would greatly appreciate if you consider donating to this initiative. I will send the link in the chat later. My name is Olena Palko. I am a historian at Birkbeck College, University of London, and a fellow at the Polish Institute for Advanced Studies in Warsaw. I am also a co-convener of the study group for minority history. As you might have noticed, we are recording this session and the video will be available on the study group YouTube channel. You can already find the recording of our first session entitled Between Empires, Ukraine in the 19th Century, given by Dr. Fabian Baumann there. And I will also share the link with you in a second. Today is my great pleasure to welcome our second speaker, Dr. Stefan Rindlisbacher. He is a researcher at the Center for Interdisciplinary Polish Studies at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt Oder in Germany. There, he examines processes of territorialization in the early Soviet Union. He is the author of Living for the Cause, Vera Figner and Vera Zasulich and the Radical Milieu on Late Imperial Russia, published in 2014 in German. And he has published extensively on the early Soviet period. His presentation today is entitled The Territory of Ukraine and Its History. And as you all know, it is of particular importance today when territorial sovereignty of Ukraine is under threat. Thank you, Stefan, for joining us today. Let me stop sharing the poster so you can share your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Olena. I hope now you can see all my presentation. Yeah, it's an important topic, and I will try to be, how to say, not really specific much into details. I would like to provide you a general overview of this issue, the territory of Ukraine. And in the Q&A, if you don't understand certain points, please ask. And I also, a little bit different than last week, my presentation is not so much about ideas and debates on possible borders of the Ukrainian nation. Fabian Baumann has already given us really good insight into this topic last week. Today, I talk about the question of how the Ukrainian state borders and the territory came into being. I explore this border topic from two perspectives, one in foreign policies and other in domestic policies. On the one hand, today's Ukrainian territory is the result of two world wars. And on the other hand, it is also the result of longer intra-Soviet debates. Ukraine's borders thus reflect the history of Eastern Europe between 1917, 1919, and 1954. Ukraine, in its current territory, was not created all at once, but its territory came into being step by step. Hence, I structure my presentation accordingly. First, I will give you some insights into the formation of the Ukrainian Soviet state, or the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, and then the territorial rearrangements between Ukraine and the RSFSR between 1924 and 1928. Actually, that's also where I've done the most research. So please forgive me to be a little bit more into the details there than in the other chapters, but I will try to be fair. Then I will talk about the Second World War and its aftermath, and then the transfer of Crimea in 1954. In my presentation, I show that borders are man-made, like nationalities and nations. However, this does not mean or imply that today's borders should be altered or revised. And one technical note, I will use the abbreviation RSFSR today a lot. It refers to the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, the largest and the most populous member republic of the Soviet Union. Only to be sure that everyone will understand me and be able to follow. So now I would like to take you to the aftermath of the First World War. Then at this time, the Bolsheviks tried to export their revolution abroad, and with the help of the Ukrainian communists, they created a satellite state in the south, the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. At the beginning of 1919, the RSFSR entered into official negotiations with the Ukrainian Soviet government, which led to a border agreement. The territory of Soviet Ukraine was defined according to the Russian-speaking provinces or guberni of the former Russian Empire. On the map, this territory is marked in rows. In the following troubles and wars, the Soviets prevailed in eastern and central Ukraine. The unfavorable for them outcome of the war with Poland led to the Treaty of Riga in March 1921. Galicia and West Volhynia, with their Ukrainian-speaking majority, fell to Poland, while the northwestern border with Poland was internationally recognized. The southwestern border with Romania remained disputed. The border here, because Romania had occupied and unilaterally annexed Bessarabia during the Russian Civil War. And also during the Soviet-Polish War, there was also a first intra-Soviet change of territory. In April 1920, the western parts of the territory of the Don Army were transferred to Soviet Ukraine. The aim of this territorial reshuffling was that the industry of the Donbass would be managed from a single Soviet republic to better coordinate the war effort against Poland. Here it is in the map, it's marked in green. Now I will quickly provide you some information about the Soviet state and with its duality of party and state. In the Soviet state, there was a one-party rule, and with its particular power structure. The party leadership could order its members in state office to obey to certain lines. They had an idea of party discipline, but when there was no order from, or no general line from above, Republican or regional politicians could gain agency. Before Stalin could position himself as undisputed Soviet leader in 1929, politicians from different Soviet republics and regions visibly competed for power and influence. Within the Soviet frame, territorial issues were one of the fields where state and party activists could legitimately compete and negotiate. They did not have to follow a certain party directive a priori. Territories thus appeared to be negotiable. Next to the South Caucasus and Central Asia, this also applied to the border between Ukraine and the RSFSR. On the one hand, party leaders from the North Caucasus, the region here, were not happy with the transfer of the Donbass industry in 1920. They saw their economic position weakened and thus demanded the port town of Taganrog here and the industrial town of Shachty from Soviet Ukraine. They justified this territorial claim with the need to develop the economy of the North Caucasus. On the other hand, representatives of the Ukrainian State and Party Commission and the Ukrainian state administration wanted to correct the border of Ukraine in the north and east to their favor. In addition to the majority Ukrainian population in the region in the north and east, they also sought to unify the sugar production in the Soviet state on the Ukrainian direction or leadership. Like the representatives of the North Caucasus, they hoped to improve the economic basis of their republic. Moreover, alongside these claims in the north, the well-recognized Ukrainian historian Mikhail Khrushchevsky called in his expert statements for the Ukrainian Soviet government to include the Kuban region to be integrated in Soviet Ukraine. He argued that this region on the northeastern shore of the Black Sea was mainly populated by Ukrainian-speaking Cossacks and therefore should be part of Soviet Ukraine. Now, the Soviet leadership in Moscow wanted to solve these territorial issues as far as possible without much public involvement within state and party commissions. And in 1924, the signs for such large territorial reshuffles were not, how to say, without perspective. In the beginning of the same year, the Belarusian Republic was also added large territories from the RSFSR. And thus the representatives of the Ukrainian state and party thought that the general political mood was in their favor. So in April of 1924, a bilateral Ukrainian RSFSR border revision commission was formed. Alexander Chervyakov, at this time head of the Belarusian Republic, became the commission's chairman. He had to play the role of a nationally unbiased arbitrator. The Ukrainian side entered these negotiations with great expectations. Their demands extended to parts of the provinces of Bryansk and Voronezh. In total, the Ukrainian claims included about 33,000 square versts, or about 37,000 square kilometers with about 2 million inhabitants, which, according to Ukrainian statistics, 65% were Ukrainian speaking and 35% were Russian speaking. In the map, this is marked with the green dotted line. So then in mid-1924, the Ukrainian side suffered its first bitter defeat. The Politburo of the Communist Party in Moscow, the supreme ruling body in the Soviet state at the time, decided that parts of eastern Ukraine, the city of Taganrog, as well as the industrial town of Shachty, should be included to the RSFSR. Thus, the Politburo accommodated demands of the North Caucasus. These were parts of the territories actually that had only been transferred from the RSFSR to Soviet Ukraine in 1920. On the map, this is marked in the dark green color. And among other things, the highest party body, the Politburo, justified this re-revision with the fact that the North Caucasus was in their need to have a deep sea port, and that the region marked in dark green was predominantly Russian-speaking. Ukrainian state and party representatives protested, but in the end, in vain. And despite this order from the Politburo, the negotiations in the Border Revision Commission continued. The two RSFSR delegates in this commission received instructions from the party leadership that the Ukrainian side should be accommodated wherever, I quote, the interests of the RSFSR are not directly affected, ending quote. Thus, they advocated, for instance, the transfer of the Putyvl county here in the north. I hope you can see it, in the southwest of the Kursk region from the RSFSR to Ukraine. This territory almost formed an enclave of the RSFSR in Ukrainian territory, and it was economically closely linked to neighboring Ukrainian regions. This county had a majority Russian-speaking population, but in this case, this concern did not matter. With then the decisive voice of Alexander Chervyakov, the Commission opted in favor of most of the Ukrainian plan. Larger territories in the north should be transferred from the RSFSR to Ukraine, including the town Belgorod. Thus, this decision was similar to the territorial support for Belarus earlier in this year, 1924. Thus, the linguistic and economic boundaries would better match the situation on the ground, was the conclusion of the majority in this commission. And also the sugar production would be under the direction of a single Soviet republic. Nevertheless, Kursk and Voronezh provinces would lose crucial economic assets. Only a few days later, the Politburo intervened again and rejected any larger territorial revisions in favor of Ukraine. The border revision should only include minor territorial changes. In the end, according to the order from the Politburo, Ukraine gained only 6,000 square kilometers inhabited by approximately 300,000 people. On the map here, these territories are all marked in yellow. This was far less than the about 13,000 square kilometers and 500,000 inhabitants Ukraine had, in quotation marks, lost after the transfer of the territories around Shachty and Taganrog. With this verdict of the Politburo in the end of 1924, the main lines for the prospective border revision between Ukraine and the RSFSR were set. However, the territorial fine-tuning took a longer time, starting in 1925, ending in 1928. At the request of local inhabitants, minor adjustments were made as well in favor of Ukraine as well as in favor of the RSFSR. Both state administrations were able to make deals However, there were also contested cases and really disputed areas. I will now take such a contested area here in Milové Čertkovo. So it's a settlement here on a contemporary map from which I found in the Ukrainian State Archive. This case of Čertkovo-Milové points to the potential for conflict that intra-Soviet borders and border revisions could unfold. In this settlement, the border between the two Soviet republics ran alongside the railway tracks, which split the settlement into two parts. The railway station itself was divided. On the Ukrainian side in Milové, a large market was regularly held in the 1920s, attracting farmers from the surrounding villages. In the era of the new economic policy, Bolsheviks reintroduced elements of free trade and money was scarce. So in relation to the local market in Milové, this meant that the Ukrainian side could generate significantly higher tax revenues. So the officials on the Russian side envied their Ukrainian colleagues for this and eventually decided to lower the tax on their side below the Ukrainian rate. Hence, they wanted to attract traders and buyers to Chertkovo. So the party secretary, Dmytro Kazachkov, from the Ukrainian district of Starobilsk, here marked in blue, to which Milové belonged, repeatedly complained to the state and party leadership about the untenable conditions that this competition created on the ground. So he complained, I quote, "The bazaar," so the market, moved in part to sites near the railroad tracks due to the repeated border crossings. That is why the number of people crossing the tracks greatly increased. One day, an accident occurred when a steam engine hit somebody. The legs of the body were found on the side, on our side, so in Ukraine, while the head fell on the side of the North Caucasus, that is in the RSFSR. Engulfed by a huge crowd, our and the Russian police forces plunged into an argument. They were arguing over responsibility for writing the report and taking care of the body. Ending quote. Kozachkov added that these were actually administrative or political peanuts, but they were symptomatic for a bigger problem. Such administrative quarrels had led to one incident as a part of the harvest was wasting under open sky in Milové Čertkovo, as the two sides could not agree on its shipping. So, in principle, the borders between the Soviet republics could be crossed without any problems, but they were still quite visible in everyday administrative life. They separate administration, taxation, official languages, and of course, access to state institutions. In Milové Čertkovo, the two sides could not agree on a border corrections. They tried, but they failed, as no one was willing to cede a single piece of territory to the other side. And in addition, the party leadership in Moscow, of course, knew about this situation, but consciously refused to issue an order in favor of one or another side. For this reason, this unsatisfactory border drawing persisted until today. As Ukrainian intellectual addressed this unsatisfactory demarcation between Ukraine and the RSFSR a little bit later in a debate with Stalin in Moscow in February 1929. The party leader initially did not want to discuss this topic. However, the participants did not want to be fobbed off with this and urged Stalin to respond. So hence the supreme, now almost established party leader told them, I quote, "We have discussed the border question several times, but we changed borders too often. Far too often we move the borders. This creates a bad impression, both inside and outside our country." Ending quote. In doing so, Stalin provided the new general line from the party leadership for dealing with border issues in the nearby future. In his eyes, border revisions within the Soviet Union only led to conflicts. Thus, nationalistic quarrels hindered socialist construction and industrialization. As a result, individuals or groups calling for intra-Soviet territorial revisions had to reckon with repression. For the time being, the limited debate on and competition around Soviet territory within the party and state structures came to an end. Now I jump a little bit to the beginning of the Second World War. At this, in 1939, the borders of Soviet Ukraine did not remain stable because of Stalin and his foreign policy. The annexation of in the West at the end of 1939 were a direct result of the Soviet expansionist policy in cooperation with Nazi Germany. Shortly before the German attack on Poland, the ideological arch-rivals Hitler and Stalin came to an agreement in a secret additional protocol to the Non-Aggression Pact to define their spheres of interest. Finland, Baltic states, Eastern Poland, as well as Bessarabia fell into the orbit of the Soviet Union. In the shadow of the German war effort, the Soviet government also pushed ahead with its expansionist policy. The Red Army invaded Eastern Poland, and after staged plebiscites, Eastern Galicia and Volhynia were attached to Soviet Ukraine. In the map, this is, it was the wrong map, here is now the correct one. In this map, this is marked in yellow. At first, the Red Army was welcomed by parts of this population in Eastern Poland, but this should turn soon after. Then in June 1940, after the defeat of France, the Soviet government finally called on Romania to cede Bessarabia together with North Bukovina. Faced with the threat of war and the loss of the French ally, the Romanian government acquiesced to Soviet pressure. About 2/3 of the former Romanian territories formed then the Moldovan SSR, but about 1/3 came to Ukraine. This is marked here in the map with blue. Here, northern Bukovina and southern Bessarabia. Soon after, minor territories alongside the Dniester River were attached from Ukraine to the Moldovan SSR. Here. In these newly annexed territories, the Soviet government ordered a rapid collectivization of agriculture, particularly in the Western Ukraine. Peasant resistance was met with harsh state terror. For this reason, German and Romanian troops were welcomed after the Operation Barbarossa had begun in 1941. That is why there was initially a disposition among the local Ukrainian peasants to support Nazi Germany. However, since the German leadership rejected Ukrainian nation state, there was no long-term cooperation between them and the Ukrainian nationalists. After the reconquest by the Red Army in 1944-45, resistance to Soviet power in these Western Ukrainian regions was particularly well organized and fierce. It took the Red Army well into the 1950s to pacify the country. The guerrilla war in Western Ukraine remained a taboo topic for a long time after. And then in the West, Carpathian Ruthenia also became part of Ukraine in 1945, here marked in orange. This area had previously experienced 3 changes of rule within 27 years. Until 1918, it was part of the Hungarian half of the Habsburg Empire. In the interwar period, the region came to Czechoslovakia. Then, following the destruction of Czechoslovakia in 1939, Carpathian Ruthenia came to Hungary. And then, after Hungary's defeat on the side of Germany in 1945, the Soviet Union claimed the region for itself. Subsequently, the Red Army occupied the territory. The Soviet leadership subjected the region to a special border regime, which severely restricted the inhabitants' freedom of movement. And of course, collectivization of agriculture was introduced simultaneously. The East Slavic-speaking inhabitants of the region saw themselves as Russini or Ruski. The Soviet authorities officially defined them as part of the Ukrainian nation. Despite the regime's efforts to weaken traditional identities, the region has got a particular position within Ukraine in cultural and linguistic terms since then. Then a final territorial change in the west of Soviet Ukraine occurred in 1951, when the Soviet Union and the Polish People's Republic exchanged territories of about 500 square kilometers. In the area around the Polish border town Belz, today Belz, a coal field had previously been discovered. Here, here marked in shaded red. The Soviet Union wanted to exploit these coal fields and in return offered Poland the hilly and war-ravaged region around Ustrzyki Dolne. On the map, this is marked here in red. The Polish government ultimately had to accept this unfavorable deal. The town of Ustrzyki Dolne itself can be regarded as example of the brutal population exchange in Eastern Europe during and after the Second World War. In the interwar period, the mixed Jewish-Polish Lemko-Shtetl was part of Poland. Many Polish residents were deported after the Soviet occupation in 1939, while the Jewish inhabitants were sent to the Nazi extermination camps during the Second World War. Then in 1917, the remaining Lemko inhabitants were expelled to Poland by the Soviets as a part of the Operation Vistula. When the place became again part of Poland in 1951, it was almost deserted. Now I would like to draw your attention to Crimea. Since the dramatic events of 2014, Crimea has been has drawn massive international attention as Russia first occupied and then annexed the peninsula. And let me begin here with a personal observation. In November 2016, an exhibition called Russia, My History was displayed in the center of Moscow. At that time, I was working in the Moscow archives, and I took the chance to pay a visit to this event. The Moscow Patriarchate financed the exhibition, and a lot of pomp and technical gimmicks were applied there. So a lot of light shows and flashes and touchscreens. And the curators presented the history of the Soviet Union and Russia since 1945 from a decisively Russian patriotic point of view. They also addressed the transfer of Crimea from the RSFSR to Ukraine in 1954. The display on this topic claimed that the transfer was a gift from the party chairman Nikita Khrushchev to Ukraine on the occasion of the 300th anniversary of the Union of Pereyaslav. The trope of Khrushchev's gift contains the basic interpretation of this transfer today in Russia. But you can find this idea also in Western media. In the upcoming minutes, I would like to explain you why such ideas of territorial gifts are rather myths that have barely any backing in official documents of the time. I'm coming back now to the map. In the interwar period, the Crimea Crimea's territorial affiliation hardly played a role in the intra-Soviet debates on border revisions. So in the 20s, there are barely any documents, either one side claiming or offering Crimea to Ukraine. At the time, the peninsula was characterized by an ethnically heterogeneous population. According to the 1937 census, around 45% Russians, 20% Crimean Tatars, 13% Ukrainians, 5% Jews, 5% Germans lived on the peninsula. In addition, Armenian, Greek, and Bulgarian communities settled there. The Second World War brought not only particularly severe devastation, but had also radical ethnical unmixing as a consequence, comparable to what we saw in Ustriki Dolne. On the one hand, many Jews fell victim to the Holocaust. On the other hand, the Soviets accused the Germans and Crimean Tatars of collaborating with Nazi Germany and deported these communities to Central Asia. From 1945 to 1991, the remaining population of the peninsula consisted mainly of Russians and Ukrainians. Ruined and depopulated, the peninsula faced tremendous challenges after 1945. The most burning economic problem was the seasonal drought. However, at the beginning of the 1950s, the State Planning Authority, Gosplan, launched a project to ensure the irrigation of Crimea. By building a canal several hundred kilometers long, water from the Dnieper River should allow the dry soils of the peninsula to bloom. Advertising brochures promised that the canal would make the peninsula a land of plenty. Economically and administratively, it seemed reasonable to transfer the peninsula from the RSFSR to Ukraine. With Stalin's death in 1953, his order that no more territorial transfers should take place fell away. Territorial revisions between Soviet republics were possible again. This is all the more so as economic planning became more and more decentralized after 1953, and the Union republics gained more control in this field. Against this background, the Supreme Soviet of the Union decided in February 1954 to transfer Crimea to Ukraine. In their explanatory statement, state and party leaders pointed to the economic prospects. During the solemn ceremony in the Supreme Soviet, for instance, Clement Voroshilov emphasized that, I quote, such a just solution of territorial question among the republics is only possible under conditions specific to the Soviet Union. This solution is grounded in economic efficiency and based on the full consent of fraternal cooperation of Soviet peoples. In the press reports, as well as in the decision of the Supreme Soviet, the transfer of Crimea was motivated solely on the basis of such economic efficiency. And it was not presented as kind of gift to Ukraine. Furthermore, Nikita Khrushchev's name was never officially mentioned in connection with the transfer of Crimea. Without wanting to go into the details here, he had not yet been able to assert himself as the only strong man in the Soviet leadership. Even though he might have wanted to, he could not have simply dictated such a far-reaching decision. Even more, back in 1954, Crimea was in such a desolate state and economic deplorable situation that we could hardly perceive it as kind of a gift, but rather as a liability to Ukraine. Then, after 1954, Crimea's infrastructure became more and more linked to Soviet Ukraine. Pipelines, canals, and electric power grids supplied the peninsula with energy and water from Ukraine. After its final completion in 1976, the North Crimean Canal allowed extensive agriculture on the peninsula. Due to the closer linkage, both sides, Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland, could benefit from each other. So now I come to the conclusion. The years from 1919 to 1954 were crucial for the formation of the Ukrainian state in the sense of territoriality. In my presentation, I have underlined how this was a result of negotiating processes in the north, here, in the east, and also in the south. But as well as a result of Soviet expansion during and after the Second World War in the West. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine gained its independence in 1991. Its internationally recognized borders correspond to those of Soviet Ukraine after 1954. Ukraine's territorial integrity was guaranteed by Russia, the US, and Britain in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 in return for Ukraine's renunciation of its nuclear weaponry. In 2010, Ukraine and Russia also agreed to accurately map and mark their common border. Border issues and border disputes between the two states therefore seem to have been resolved for good. In addition, in 2010, the administration under Viktor Yanukovych extended the leases for the Russian naval base in Sevastopol here by 25 years. Then in 2014, the Russian government saw its geopolitical interests threatened with the change of government in Kiev in spring of that year. With the stroke of a pen, it ignored the many previously given guarantees by invading and annexing Crimea and supporting the rebel republics in eastern Ukraine. In the case of both Crimea and the Donbass, the war since 2014 had devastating consequences for both sides. For instance, Ukrainian authorities blocked the North Crimean Canal and the water access to the peninsula. Crimea is dependent on supplies by sea or via the Kerch Strait Bridge, which has been opened in May 2018. Nonetheless, the peninsula heavily suffered under the water shortages. In Milove Chertkovo, where the international border still crosses the settlement, the inhabitants' everyday life became increasingly difficult. A large border fence prohibited border crossings, and the local railway stopped simply functioning. After the all-out Russian attack on Ukraine in February this year, one of the first things Russian troops did was to secure the North Crimean Canal's access to the Dnieper River, and they tried pumping water to Crimea. Thus, conflicts for water, or in a broader sense, economic issues and interests, do play a role in the ongoing war. But to be honest, now I have to stop. As a historian, I'm a professional to look back in time and thus cannot predict the future or provide you with some well-elaborated scenarios. I know that in the current situation, this is an unsatisfactory utterance. Nonetheless, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan, for this overview and for your conclusions. I would remind everyone that you can send your questions or comments in the chat, and I will read them out to Stefan. So to start with, we have already one question. So while our guests are thinking, I think it's a good question that was raised at the very beginning of your talk. When do you argue Ukraine gained its independence? After the First World War or in 1991? So basically, when shall we say Ukraine got its history? When shall we start telling the history of Ukraine from?
So, yes, it's how to say, a fundamental question. And I would think from, let's say, this now existing Ukrainian state. It is, to a certain extent, the successor of Soviet Ukraine. And Soviet Ukraine was founded in 1919. And the state today, with its institutions, I had a discussion also with other colleagues. And I would say, yeah, the state today is not in a direct tradition of the, let's say, Ukrainian People's Republic of 1917, nor is it in the tradition of this UPA-ON movement. Of course, the state today also imagines itself as being in this tradition, but by its institutions, in my view, it's Soviet.
Thank you. I would just want to say that if you wish to ask your question in person, just let me know. So there is another question. Could you please comment on one of the supposed causes of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014? The end of the Russia-Ukraine treaty on the lease of Sevastopol, whether it was the end of the Russia-Ukraine treaty on the lease of Sevastopol naval base, if you could comment on that.
Yeah.
You can also see the question in the chat. So if you could comment on one of the supposed causes of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. So a little bit more on the end of the lease treaty.
Yeah. So here I can only speculate, but of course, there was an agreement previously in 2010 about the extension of this lease under the Yanukovych government. And then the government changed in 2014. And yeah, from the perspective of the Russian government, it wasn't sure if this new government will stick to this lease agreement. And in this case, they took the opportunity to ensure that they can keep the naval base by force. This, of course, was one of several reasons. And it's, of course, impossible now for me to this late hour to really bring every point out. But, of course, there was this geostrategic, how to say, reasoning of the Russian government. I do not say that I agree with this, but it's a perception that exists in Moscow and was, in my opinion, decisive for the move or for the attack in 2014.
Thank you. Then there is a question on Moldova. On one of the maps, you showed the territory of Moldovan autonomous SSR is shown as part of Ukraine. Whether you could comment a little bit on that, how this transformation from being a part of Ukraine to the sort of the Moldovan Republic happened.
So now I have to, how to say, confess, I'm not an expert in the Moldovan Autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic, but it was also, how to say, long-term considerations from the Soviet government. Yeah, we should actually encourage this Moldovan statehood, also in expectation of a larger border revision with Romania. So this autonomous republic was created within Ukraine in regions that were populated by Moldovan or Romanian-speaking communities. Here, I do not want to get into the topic, what's actually the difference between Romanian and Moldovan. It's an intricate debate, but in 1923, this autonomous entity was created. And then in 1940, this actually the territories that were by majority populated by Moldovan-speaking communities were attached to the Moldovan Soviet Republic. And these territories around what was town around Balta, because Balta was the capital of the Moldovan Autonomous Republic within Ukraine. They were again reincorporated or fully reincorporated in the Ukraine frame without autonomous status. And also the other, how to say, issue is that actually the territories then attached from Ukraine to the Moldovan Soviet Republic are mostly conflating with today's Transnistria, but that's a completely other issue.
Thank you, Stefan. The next question is just building on what you just said. What you just said about the legacy, the Soviet legacy. So you argue that the current Ukrainian state is much more successor of Soviet Ukraine than of the 1917 People's Republic. Do you know how the People's Republic, or if any other attempt at Ukrainian states from the period 1917-1922 appear in contemporary discourse in Ukraine? Is the period 1917-1922 an important historical reference for Ukrainian national identity today?
Of course, it is. We should here distinguish between, let's say, the institutional tradition, let's say, the governing bodies, the ministries, and the ideas of Ukrainian statehood. Because in from 1917 to 1920, 21, 22. We have also the West Ukrainian People's Republic with its legacy. It also plays a role in West for whole Ukraine, and then also to a certain extent the hetmanate. And I'm not yet sure how it is today. Probably you participants from the audience know it better. The Machno movement and its legacy. How much does it play a role today in Ukraine? I'm not really, how to say, here on the top of the current debate, but I think it also plays a role.
Thank you. Just from myself, I'd say yes, definitely. Those all forms of Ukrainian statehood in the current discourse, they have great importance really for the narrative and for the process of history writing. There is a question about the maps you showed. If you could share the source. I assume perhaps those maps that were prepared by you, because I know it, but maybe you could just comment on that a little bit.
Yes, actually, I am to blame for all the mistakes on these maps, and I apologize. Part of the maps are in German language, so I drafted them for another purpose. It was for a German publication. The first map I showed was in English because I've planned this for an English language publication. So for this, my apologies. And yes, I drafted these maps together with a map drawer from Leipzig. So, of course, for me, or for us, it's always difficult probably I should also say, please don't take this as complete, as reality. Take it always with a grain of salt. It's, how to say, what I want to show, to illustrate certain things. These are not legally binding maps. They can contain mistakes, and if there are severe mistakes, together with this map drawer, we can correct them.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you perhaps the last question, unless there will be more questions from the audience. I was actually wondering myself how well demarcated those borders with Russia and Belarus are now, if you know. Is it still just a line? Is it kind of, does it still, exist on paper only, or is it already a well demarcated and protected line? Because seeing watching how with how easily Russian military can enter Ukraine, I'm just wondering what the border looks like, basically. Yeah. If you know.
Theoretically, there was this bilateral border marking commission between Ukraine and Russia in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And actually, I have not seen their exact results, but they should have exact maps of the now legally binding, internationally recognized border. And as far as I know, back from Soviet times, the border was actually designed to match pastures and fields of neighboring villages. So in Soviet times, every change of field or pasture between one village to another in the border area was always considered as a small change of the Republican border. So in theory, except for the case of Milovecherkovo, which I highlighted. The border drawing was in the majority of cases kind of smoothly. The Russian and the Ukrainian side agreed on a border that would actually fit into the agricultural use of a certain region, so that actually both bordering villages could access all fields and harvest or go to the forests where needed. So from a theoretical perspective, this border should actually be, how to say, kind of feasible and not creating a lot of troubles. There are troubles, and yeah, I mostly I could highlight all these troubles, but we would ignore that in most cases, actually, the Soviet bureaucracy, as well as now the independent states in the 2000s and beginning of 2010s, were actually able to find convenient solutions for both sides.
Thank you, Stefan. If there are no more questions, I would just say huge thank you, Stefan, for your time, for this wonderful lecture, for this overview of the history of Ukraine's borders, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Just to say that our next lecture will be next Wednesday on the 27th of April, and this will be my lecture entitled The Many Faces of Ukraine, Ukraine's Ethnic Diversity. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all there. And we will have a recording which we will circulate among all those registered, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Thank you once again, Stefan, and
yeah, thanks you for your attention. So, all right.